it will have a significant effect on the American economy. Watching Donald Trump in the Rose Garden reminded me of that famous scene in Blazing Saddles, where the sheriff puts a gun to his own head and says to the townsfolk to put down their guns or he'll blow his own head off. Tariffs are self-damaging.
Well, just in the last few minutes, we've had a statement from the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, saying we'll always act in the best interests of UK businesses and consumers. That's why throughout the last few weeks, the government's been fully focused on negotiating an economic deal with the US that strengthens our existing fair and balanced trading relationship. The statement goes on to say that the US is our closest ally. Our approach is to remain calm and committed to doing this deal, which we hope will mitigate the impact of what's been announced today. We have a range of tools at our disposal and will not hesitate to act. We'll continue to engage with UK businesses, including on their assessment of the impact of any further steps to take. And Jonathan Reynolds adds, nobody wants a trade war and our intention remains to secure a deal, but nothing is off the table and the government will do everything necessary to defend the UK's national interest. Oh, well, let's talk to Blair McDougall. He's a Labour MP and he's on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Good evening to you, Blair.
Good evening. How are you doing?
Very well. Delighted to have you with us. Clearly, the government had hoped to negotiate an exemption. What do you think will be the response to the fact that we have been hit by 10% tariffs, but it could have been worse, couldn't it?
It could have been worse, and I think there's tremendous credit to Jonathan Reynolds and the Prime Minister and the work they've done to try to manage what I think everyone can see is a pretty difficult relationship with the Trump administration. But it's not a cause for celebration that we've been hit by less than other countries, because the 10% of all goods coming into the UK are from the United States. So even though we seem to have been had a slightly lighter touch than other nations, this will still have an impact on us.
Do you think there is a personal aspect to this? Clearly, Donald Trump had some very strong words for the EU, which is going to be charged 20%, and indeed for South Africa, 60% on goods from there. Do you think that perhaps that relationship which Sir Keir Starmer has managed to establish with President Trump maybe spared us from worse?
It perhaps did. I think we know one thing about Donald Trump in terms of how to negotiate with him, which is that flattery gets you much further than confrontation does. And I think watching the scenes in the Rose Garden, you mentioned South Africa. There was a deep element of politics to this, absolutely. There was obviously personalities involved as well. Trump was giving a sort of litany of those leaders who he got on with and who he didn't get on with. But there's a lot of performance to this from Trump as well. I think we've seen with earlier announcements on tariffs that they don't necessarily last very long, that he tends to change his mind on these things as often as he changes his underwear. And so I think the approach the UK government's taking, just to sort of take their time, see where things go from here and decide how to react on it is correct, because where the US administration is today is not necessarily where they'll be tomorrow or next week.
Yeah, because in the Commons earlier, Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, was challenging him to put up a more robust response to immediately threaten to retaliate, as we've seen in the past Canada do. But do you think that Sir Keir Starmer can still manage to negotiate an end to these tariffs on British goods?
Well, we've got to try, because the United States is our one of our biggest trading partners and so important in so many markets. I'm a Scottish MP, and obviously whiskey is a huge export market is the United States. But Ed Davey earlier on, he repeatedly kept saying we don't want a trade war, and then was calling on retaliation. And one of the examples he gave for retaliation was, he said, well, let's put tariffs on Tesla cars, because that would reach straight into the administration. And as you're reporting this evening, it may well be that Elon Musk is being shown the door by the administration. And I think that just goes to reinforce the need to take our time with this, to see how things are really developing rather than taking knee-jerk actions, which frankly would make a lot of us feel very good because, a lot of us don't particularly like this American administration and the way it conducts itself. But that's not necessarily the best thing for the country and for those companies who are looking at 10% tariffs tonight.
Yeah, I mean, the UK exports some £60 billion worth of goods to America. Things clearly could have been worse, but undoubtedly, these tariffs are going to have a significant effect, aren't they, on those businesses and our wider economy?
They will, but I also think it will have a significant effect on the American economy. Watching Donald Trump in the Rose Garden reminded me of that famous scene in Blazing Saddles, where the sheriff puts a gun to his own head and says to the townsfolk to put down their guns or he'll blow his own head off. Tariffs are self-damaging. What Trump has done is put an enormous tax on virtually everything that the United States imports. So in time, I think we will see internal pressure on Donald Trump to change course here. And in many ways, that'll be much more important than almost anything that external actors do and any sort of diplomacy. Because tariffs have never worked in the history of the world. They are just a tax that decreases productivity, increases costs, increases unemployment, and also at a time when the world is already an incredibly tense place, it increases international tension between nations. So I think it's wise to take time with this and see what the reaction is, not just around the world, but also within the United States to the economic impact of this.
The Office for Budget Responsibility has been warning in the last few days that tariffs like this could wipe out all of the Chancellor's headroom, which she created after doing some more hasty cuts to things like the welfare budget only a week ago. How concerned are you that this is going to put a spanner into the works, if I can use that analogy, of the Chancellor's sums, and that she'll have to come back in the autumn with more spending cuts and perhaps tax rises?
Well, again, we'll see where we get to with these tariffs. I think there'll be an element of people around Westminster and Whitehall breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief that we've not been hit with the tariffs that the EU and other major economies have been hit with, and as a result, the economic impact will be less than we worried about. But you mentioned the OBR. I mean, the OBR also warned about retaliation and that would make us poorer as well. So the Chancellor today was right to say that while there be short-term difficulties around these tariffs, the bigger sort of prize in the relationship with the United States is getting that economic deal with them. And that's sort of taking care of two birds with one stone. It's about removing the harm of the tariffs, but also opening up opportunities for growth, which in turn will help us with the public finances and the funding of public services.
One of our listeners, Nigel's, got in touch. He says, we seem to have got off lightly with 10% tariffs, but isn't the bigger issue the 25% on all cars, which will hit our car manufacturers very hard? And we know, don't we, that the British motor industry is already going through lots of huge problems. I mean, that is going to be a very, very difficult additional cost for the motor industry.
It is, and the United States, I think, is the second largest export market for motor manufacturers after the EU. So it's a bitter blow for those companies like Jaguar, Land Rover, companies making the Mini. These are really important markets for them. And I think the fact that he's done that in a blanket way across the whole world is another reason why we've really got to put our back into this economic agreement, because it looks like the only option you've got there is to try to come up with some sort of deal to carve out the United Kingdom from these tariffs. But, it's going to be a very tough job with, to put it kindly, an unpredictable American president.
Blair McDougall, Labour MP for East Renfrewshire, member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lots of you have been getting in touch. Neil says if it wasn't for Brexit, we'd have been hit with the EU level of tariff tomorrow, which is double. And we'd have been affected by whatever retaliation the EU may impose on the US. It's only because of Brexit that the PM has the ability to take time to come up with a calm and considered response to the US tariffs. That was from Neil. Glyn also says, thank God for Brexit, but he adds, pity Farage isn't our PM. And we've also heard from Keith saying, surely we can't retaliate if we already charge America 10%. But Paul says, why can't the free world just boycott America? Most of the items they produce are of appalling quality, are not worth buying. Thanks for that, Paul. Thanks for all your views. Do keep them coming into us here on Times Radio.